All right, so hope everyone had a good weekend. We are getting rapidly close to the um, somehow to the end of the first half of the course. We're obviously moving at a very condensed pace here in this summer version of the course. Where we are basically covering 2 weeks of material each week in the class. So this week we are we'll finish up our discussion of Aristotle and move into our discussion of Machiavelli today and finish up our discussion of Machiavelli's The Prince on Thursday. And then next week we have two more classes, both on Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, and we have a week break. Now, things to keep in mind, of course, is one, the first paper assignment, which I gave to you last class and which is posted on the e-class. Please make sure to note that the full guidelines of the assignment are posted. There's a link for the Turnitin portal to submit your paper, but then there's also a link to the full guidelines in a separate document. So please make sure to read over the full guidelines carefully, which I went over last class. And then, of course, uh, we've got, sorry, just looking, I'll come back to the question in the chat. Um, um, uh, And then, of course, we've got a week-long break after your papers are due on Friday, the 12th. The following week is off, and it's a kind of reading week. And then when we come back, we have our first of two in-person exams in the class. So I will be letting you know very soon about the guidelines for that exam. You'll have those by next week, so that you can prepare for the exam on the 23rd. I will also be providing you very soon, once I have it. The university is finding a room for us, so you'll need to stay tuned for the room that we'll be writing the exam in. Um, and uh, and then we have that on the 23rd, the Tuesday after we get back from the break week, and then we jump into our second half material. Um, okay, so there's a question in the chat about Aristotle's Politics, Book 3, Chapter 6 to 18, but can't find 18 in Book 3. It is there. Book 3, Chapter 18 is on page 396 of the textbook. So 396 of the textbook is right before Book 4 starts. Is Chapter 18 in our textbook. Okay, so that's what I'm looking at here. If you continue to have any issue with that, please let me know. Another question in the chat. So I assume the exam means that we will not have an online meeting on the 23rd. That is absolutely correct, John. No online lecture on the 23rd. We're just in person that day for the exam. All right. So let's jump back into our discussion of Aristotle, and we'll try to wrap that up in the first half of today's lecture, and then move on to our discussion of Machiavelli. Okay, so we had finished off last time our discussion of Book 1 and the various themes that we wanted to pull out of Book 1. And here we get the picture of um, basically a lot of different aspects of Aristotle's thought coming out in this book, in this section of the text, where we get a sense of how Aristotle sees um, the world, how he sees the world as kind of everything being created with a purpose, with a task, and not in and so nothing, nature makes nothing um, uh, uh, without a point, and so without a purpose. And so you have this sense that everything in the world has a task, and those tasks fit together until you have a kind of self-sufficient unit. And that self-sufficient unit is what allows all the parts to do what they are meant to do. And it allows the whole to reach its highest development. So each of the parts kind of fulfills its nature, and the whole that they comprise together can reach its full nature. And so for human beings, and in particular the freeborn male households, and the freeborn male heads of household, you have Aristotle claiming that we have a certain political nature. We are by nature political animals. And of course, he says that about human beings, but then it becomes clear that, well, a lot of these human beings are kind of simply serving the freeborn male heads of households as he describes what the household looks like. And it's clear that most human beings are in the household kind of just doing the necessary labor and necessary tasks that free up the male head of the household to be able to um, kind of engage in politics. So you've got the father-child relationship, where the father provides the necessary reason for the child because it's undeveloped as of yet. The husband-wife relationship, where Aristotle claims that the husband provides the authority that is lacking from women, from the wife, to the deliberative capacity. So he says that as we went over last class, he said women have this deliberative faculty, but it lacks authority. And so some argument there about the man providing a certain authority to decision making and to deliberative capacity. And so the wife is kind of reliant upon the husband for this reason. And of course, the master-slave relationship, where the slave, Aristotle argues, is lacking the deliberative capacity, reason, and therefore is basically a natural born instrument for the use of the master. And so you have these hierarchies, and notice that they are all based on an idea about reason and reasoning capacity. And this is important because it comes to shape, you know, a huge amount of philosophical and political thought for centuries around the about political power, and the fact that political power and political participation and power of any kind being tied to some ideas about reasoning capacity. And that obviously also leads to a legacy of valuing rational labor, mental labor over manual labor. And so you see a real um, a very serious um, kind of commitment of a kind to and a kind of ideology based around the capacities for reason. And that justifies a whole bunch of hierarchies. Now, all of that leads to the idea for Aristotle that um, the highest capabilities for human beings are for, and again, that is only really realized in the free-born, that is non-slave male, um, adult male, who um, can use their deliberative capacity not only to lead the slaves and children and women in their lives, but to realize the highest form of the good life. Um, and so that is because human beings, he says, um, their highest stage of development, their highest form is in politics, is in political society. That is why humans are by nature political animals, he says, because their highest nature is realized in politics. And the reason, again, for that is he talks about human beings being given speech, language, and speech. And it's speech that allows human beings to articulate and debate ideas of the good and to deliberate about ideas of what is good for human beings to do. So that is where our distinctive, it's through language and speech that our distinctive moral capabilities appear. The ability to discriminate between higher and lower, good and bad. And so that it's in that deliberative process about good and bad and aligning our lives and our actions with the good that we realize our highest natures as human beings. Again, only a small segment of human beings will realize that, but this is nonetheless how Aristotle articulates it. Now, this leads me to a kind of I just want to say a little bit more, and this is kind of comprised or compiled from a bunch of different things and an overview of various themes in Aristotle's thought in this text. But I just want to say a little bit more broadly about this relationship between politics and the good life for Aristotle. Because clearly his argument is that human beings are by nature political because the good life for human beings, the highest form of life for human beings, is only realized in politics in some way or in political society. So a few points I just want to make here. So for Aristotle, the best form of government is that in which every person can act best and live happily. So the point of government is to allow people to live the good life. So politics is really about virtue. It's about the ability to live a virtuous life. And again, for Plato, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, despite some differences between them, there is an overall sense here among all three that that human happiness comes from living virtuously. So morality and happiness are really tied together. The ability to live virtue is also what cultivates our souls and creates a contented, good life. And so government is geared towards helping us all live virtuously, to act best, as I've said here, and to live happily. So what is the best life for Aristotle. The best life is a life of moral virtue that is sufficiently equipped with the nature, character, judgment, habits, and resources needed to perform virtuous action. So for Aristotle, you need all of these things. You need the right nature to live a virtuous life, to live the best life. And that's what we said earlier. A lot of people don't have that nature, including women, children, slaves. So you have to have the right nature to live the best kind of human life. You also need the right kind of cultivated character and judgment and habits. For Aristotle, habits and character are really tied together. You have to build up habits and practices of virtuous living. And you also need resources for that. And that's where, again, the household comes into place. The household provides the necessary resources for the head of household to be able to have the resources and the time and and they have the nature to be able to practice moral virtue. So most of the people in the household are simply allowing the adult male head of the household to be able to have the resources and time to be able to perform virtuous action. So again, the point here about living happily, happiness comes for Aristotle from developing and exercising your natural capacities to the fullest extent possible. So this is again the teleology of Aristotle, the idea that you have a kind of nature, you have a task that is meant to be fulfilled. And so your full maturity or development is what nature kind of intends for you or wants for you. There's a striving there toward it doesn't always get achieved. In fact, it often does not get achieved, but the purpose is to move in that direction, to try to fulfill your purpose, your potentialities. And so for Aristotle, he also believes that happiness comes from we get a certain contentment from developing and exercising our natural capacities. Things that we get, and this is we've all probably experienced moments like this where you find that in growing, in developing something that you weren't able to do before, something that you have some ability to do, that produces a kind of contentment. It produces a kind of happiness and satisfaction as you grow and develop into and realize your potentialities. So this is the kind of broad point that Aristotle is making, where happiness really, one of the key roots of happiness for human beings. And how do we develop these natural capacities? And in particular, as we've said before, these natural capacities for moral virtue are the most important ones of the most important capacities. Our abilities for moral and intellectual virtue. These are the crucial capabilities. And how do we exercise them? Well, for Aristotle, human beings best cultivate moral virtue, the treating others as they ought to be treated in a way. You develop that through what he calls a kind of civic friendship. And that is a relationship among people, among friends, among kind of relative equals who can can share with one another, who can freely give and receive from others. This is civic friendship for Aristotle. It's contrasted with relationships of necessity. And those are the relationships within the household. They provide for our basic necessities. But outside, it's only outside of necessity. Necessity kind of compels us in certain ways. It forces us in some ways. But outside of necessity is where kind of freedom comes in. And it's through that, what you can freely give to others, the gifts and that you can share with others, and that and the kind of relating that you can do with others that is not compelled in any particular way. That's where virtue is exercised. If you're forced to do something, if it's required, if it's necessary, that doesn't really show moral virtue. Moral virtue is exercised when you don't have to do it. And so, what Aristotle feels is that for human beings, virtue is really exercised in relationships of kind of friendship among citizens, and where you come to think of others, and you come to become civically minded. You think about the good, the overall good for everyone, rather than just yourself. And that, for Aristotle, is strongly cultivated in participation in politics, sharing and ruling, to rule and be ruled in turn, he says. That is where we develop our and practice, and we gain habits in moral virtue. And so this is why human beings need political community to really achieve their full natures, their full potentialities, because it's in politics that we generally share in ruling, and we practice and learn to think about others and kind of uh, be able to become virtuous beings. So this is a big picture kind of way of thinking about how Aristotle thinks about the relationship between politics and the good life, the moral life, which we have to kind of keep in mind. Now, Aristotle, however, is also a very practical thinker. He is one of his main contrasts with his teacher, Plato, is that he finds Plato far too idealistic, in a sense that Plato constructs the absolute ideal without paying enough mind to the practical circumstances. So Aristotle likes to think about ideals, but he's very practical as well, and he wants to think about different levels um, of what is good in any particular moment in political life. And so he doesn't want to be limited with the absolute ideal. He wants to think about the ideal in lots of different ways. And so Aristotle has a, if we think of Plato maybe more as like an idealistic moral philosopher, an idealistic political thinker who spends most of the Republic thinking about the absolute kind of ideal and constructing a kind of perfect ideal. That is at least one of his main tasks. Aristotle is much more scientific in his thinking, where he wants to survey all the existing possibilities in the world, and to look at them and take them seriously and figure out how to hone them and how to improve them. So Aristotle has a much more grounded approach, one that is much less entirely idealistic, and one that is much more about what he will call practical wisdom, practical judgment, how to make judgments in a particular context that are good for that time and place and aren't necessarily focused on the ideal in the abstract. So this is where we get into a lot of Aristotle's more political science, his kind of taxonomy of different political regimes and constitutions. So this is where we get into book three. And it's in book three that Aristotle lays out some of his key definitions of different kinds of what he calls political forms of government or forms of constitution. So different types of constitutions or ways of organizing authority over the whole community is his focus here in book three, laying out the different kinds of constitutions that there are. Not entirely dissimilar from how Plato does it in book 8 of the Republic, where Plato's kind of telling a different story there, and he's kind of doing some different things. Aristotle's approaching this much more. He's not talking about like necessarily just like a critical take on all of these different corrupted regimes. Aristotle wants to look at regimes, and he's much more kind of ecumenical about different kinds of political regimes or constitutions, and he lays them out and defines them here in book three. And the way you define a type of constitution or a form of government for Aristotle is who is the governing class on one hand, and secondly, in whose interest does that governing class rule? Okay, so these are two crucial elements that comprise Aristotle's definitions of different kinds of regimes. So it ends up he ends up articulating something kind of like this chart, can be condensed into this kind of chart. So on the one hand, you've got the variable about in whose interest does the ruling class rule. You can either rule in, there's two main options here. You can either rule in the common interest, the common good, and those are the correct forms of constitution because any good form of political rule needs to rule in the collective interest, the common good for the whole polity or the whole society, the polis, the political community. Or the alternative is, and this is a deviant form of constitution, these are constitutions that are corrupted or not functioning as they should. That is that is ruling in the private interest. Ruling for the good of the rulers themselves rather than for the collective good. And then on the other variable is who's the ruling class, and that is kind of, at least initially, Aristotle articulates it as in a numerical way, the rule of one, the rule of the few, or the rule of the many. He ends up kind of altering this a little bit, and he um, kind of alters the definition slightly here, but he begins with a kind of numerical definition. So if you have rule of one person and they rule in the common interest, that's a good, correct form of constitution. That's a proper kingship. So a kingship or a proper monarchy there is rule of one in the common interest. But if you have a corrupt ruler or king, monarch, who rules in their own private interest, that Aristotle calls a tyranny. Furthermore, if you have rule of a few, a small group of people in the common interest, that Aristotle calls an aristocracy. Rule of a few excellent people, people with great merit and excellence, that is an aristocracy. They rule, there's a few of them, small group, they rule in the public interest. But if they are if there you have a few people who rule in their own private interests, and Aristotle ends up saying this is almost always, when you have this kind of situation, it's almost always the moneyed classes, it's almost always the wealthy elite that rules in its own interest. If it's a small subgroup of the people, a minority of the people who rules in their own private interest over the masses, that tends to be an oligarchy, the rule of what tends to be understood as a rule of the wealthy. That's an oligarchy. And then you have rule of the many. Rule of the many in their own interest, in the interest of the whole, is he calls a polity. So he has an interesting kind of terminology here. He calls this polity, rule of the many in the common interest. But if you have rule of the many in the interests of the masses, the poor masses, because again, here the masses tend to be thought of, and we saw this with Plato too, the masses tend to be thought of as the poor. So there's an economic dimension that enters into the practical realities here, both with oligarchy and democracy. Democracy is ruled by the masses in the interests of the masses, the poor masses. That is democracy. And that is a third corrupt or deviant form of constitution in which, rather than ruling for the whole, you rule in the interests of the of the particular ruling class. John.
Yes, considering that Plato believes that in order for you to foster virtue, you need to participate in political life. Wouldn't polity be his ideal form of government?
Great question, and that to answer that, uh, um, I'm not sure. I thought maybe you said Plato there initially, but I'm assuming you mean
I
Aristotle.
meant Aristotle.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
We've just been covering too much Plato.
Yeah. Of course. It's a great question you ask, and we are going to get to it in a moment, actually. And it turns out Aristotle's answer is a bit it's a it we can't just talk about his ideal in a singular form, and we're going to talk about that momentarily because he breaks up the idea of the ideal into different ways, and his answer might actually be a bit confusing, but you're definitely on the right track where the fact that he emphasizes the virtue producing the virtue generating aspect of political participation does lead towards a much greater valorization of polity than, say, someone like Plato, who, was very much in the camp of a kingship or an aristocracy, rule of either one philosopher king or a small group of philosopher kings in the interest of everyone. That was Plato's ideal. Aristotle will be much more amenable to polity because of the reason you mentioned, tying back to my previous slide. So we'll get there in just a moment, but good. You're certainly on the right track. Good question. Okay, so this is what Aristotle lays out initially. 6 kinds of regimes, 3 correct forms and 3 deviant forms, depending on whether they rule in the private interest or whether they rule in the common good, the common interest. The fact that all good political regimes should rule in the common interest means that that's what defines the correct constitutions. Now, in books 3 and 4 as well, we get what we can think of as Aristotle's science of politics. And again, here we have much more of a scientific approach. We can think of it as a more scientific approach, a more empirical, if we put it that way, approach to politics than, say, with Plato. Plato is approaching everything through the normative judgment of like what's ideal and what's lesser than the ideal, what's a deficient or corrupt in relation to the ideal. Aristotle, again, tries to be much more empirical about things and tries to take a more nuanced view and a less moralistic, say, view on everything, even though he's deeply, deeply guided by moral considerations, as we've seen as well. But what Aristotle articulates for us is that, and this statement comes in these early chapters of Book 4. So I'm jumping around a little bit here, but what Aristotle articulates for us is that a statesman or a political scientist, someone who's analyzing politics and trying to understand politics and contribute to it, needs to understand and to have various levels of what he calls practical wisdom. That is, forms of judgment of how to know what is best to do in practical circumstances. So, a statesman or a political scientist, someone who's observing politics or involved in politics, should have various levels of practical wisdom regarding a variety of different standards that come into play when making judgments in politics. First, a statesman or a political scientist should be able to discuss and have a sense of the best constitution imaginable given absolutely ideal conditions. So if you could just think of the ideal, and in perfect circumstances, what would that be? And what constitution would be suited to it? That would be one level of judgment. If you could, again, this is kind of more Plato's task in the Republic, is to think up the best constitution imaginable. But Aristotle says we need to go beyond that. We need to also think about the best constitution that is generally attainable, given generally available conditions. So this is a different level of judgment. It's a little bit more grounded. It's not as pie in the sky. It's not about what would be perfect if we could have, highly unusual circumstances, but it is under pretty generally available conditions, what would be the best in those circumstances? That's a different level of judgment, a different kind of ideal, a different standard. Third, you have the best constitution given the particular composition of a specific society. So this is where you really get to be like a grounded political scientist. It's like, because you're not talking generally or in the ideal at all now. You're talking about a specific society. You're learning about a specific society, the particular composition of demographics within that society, and then what would be the best constitution for that. Oh, somebody's got their mic on, so please mute yourselves. So then you've got the best constitution in that sense of like, if you're looking at a particular society, you know it, and you can judge what is best for it given its particular its particular composition. And Aristotle also kind of seems to make a fourth category here, where he seems to suggest that there's also another level of practical wisdom, which is about what would be the best here and now in this moment under very specific non-ideal constraints that are in play or operable in this moment. What would be the best improvements or reforms that could and should be made here and now? So that's even a bit more specific than the previous one, where it's specific. You're thinking about what the ideal is for a very specifically constituted society. But the fourth category is more about what would be the best reforms to make? What would be the best improvements to make in this here and now to move it towards the best possible composition for this particular society? So these are all different levels of political judgment. So Aristotle makes this much more complicated than simply thinking about the ideal and ranking the alternatives in relation to that ideal. He thinks about the ideals in a much more pluralistic, complicated way. And he lays out what he thinks about for what he tells us a bit more about what he can say about these categories, especially those that can be spoken of in general. So, what is the best constitution for Aristotle? Well, that depends again on the categories that we've just been talking about. Again, the best constitution in the abstract or in the ideal. So this is the first category we've just been talking about. So what is the best in the abstract or in the ideal? Now, this is where John's question previously gets to be pretty interesting, and Aristotle's answer might be a bit confusing here. And we're not going to be able to solve this. I just want to flag it for the moment, and we have to kind of ponder how Aristotle arrives at this, given some other things that he will argue. But what Aristotle argues is that in the ideal, in the abstract, a kingship or an aristocracy will be the best in the ideal, in the sense that it is that in the sense that if you have a person or a group of people that is so virtuous, is so excelling in moral and intellectual excellence and virtue, if you happen to have those people in your society, they should be the rulers. So this is where, in the abstract, Aristotle kind of agrees with his mentor Plato, in a sense, that if you happen to have truly excellent people that are so far above others in their virtue, they should actually rule. Others should follow them. And they will teach the people what they need to know. They will guide the people and cultivate the people as best needed. But they should always follow these great people. But what Aristotle says very quickly after making this point is that this is almost impossible. You almost never get this. You almost never get human beings that are so far superior to others in their excellence that it makes this, again, rather abstract. So this kind of constitution requires many natural advantages of the small group of people who will rule, the one or the small group that will rule, and is therefore impossible for most states. Most people, most places just simply do not have a class of people who are so excellent in this way above others that they are almost divinely suited to rule. Aristotle almost talks about them as like a superhuman kind of group, and that's why they're exceedingly rare. They occur from time to time, but they're very, very rare, and so most societies should not a kingship or an aristocracy is not in the cards for most societies. If it just happens to be, if you're blessed by the gods in this way with this unbelievable leader or small group of leaders, sure, follow them because it would be wrong not to follow such excellent people. They're kind of like gods on earth. So now that's the ideal. But what about in practice, in general, under what we call generally available conditions? And this is precisely what I mentioned earlier, and John asked about is where Aristotle leads for under actually available, generally available conditions and composition of society. Polity is, in fact, Aristotle writes or argues, is the kind of best form of constitution in general. And that is, again, the many ruling together in the common interest. But how do you actually get that? How do you get the many ruling? Again, because there's also the many ruling in their own interest. Democracy, that's what he called democracy, where the poor masses rule, but they rule not with the common good of the whole society. They only rule in the private interest of the poor masses, which doesn't actually lead to a successful society. So, what how do you approximate a polity in practice? Well, what Aristotle ends up telling us in the chapters of in kind of within book 3 kind of lays out how you achieve a polity. And polity is kind of created by fusing oligarchic elements with democratic elements. So what does he mean by this? He means you distribute certain powers, political powers, and decision-making abilities to the wealthy. You distribute certain decision-making based on wealth, and certain powers based on just citizenship. Anyone who's a citizen, that's democracy. And so you combine certain oligarchic elements with certain democratic elements so that they balance each. Remember, oligarchy and democracy are both corrupted forms because they pursue the private interest of the wealthy or the private interest of the poor. Here, you balance those off by balancing oligarchic and democratic elements so that you kind of approximate a polity, rule of the many in the interests of all. So this is how Aristotle thinks you kind of approximate in most generally available conditions. This is how you approximate the best possible constitution. And he provides some different arguments here about why broader participation is often and can be better than the judgment of, in most cases, is better than judgment of just a few small people, few small numbers of people. So Aristotle makes a number of arguments here in various parts of Book 3 that actually are quite like his mentor Plato would really bristle at, where Aristotle kind of lauds and holds up the value of having many people involved in decision making. Not only does that help lead to the cultivation of virtue, which leads to the good life, but also in practical political terms, Aristotle argues it leads to better judgment for the society. So notice what he says in a couple of places here. Let me go to, let's see here. Book 3, chapter 11. This is page 387 of our textbook. And here he says, there's a point, there's an actual truth behind the idea that the multitude, the masses, should actually participate in ruling, and that sometimes they do better, and in some ways they do better than like the few. And notice what he says here. This is the beginning of chapter 11. For the many who are not as individuals excellent men, nevertheless can, when they have come together, be better than the few best people, not individually but collectively, just as feasts to which many contribute are better than feasts provided at one person's expense. For being many Each of them can have some part of virtue and practical wisdom. And when they come together, the multitude is just like a single human being with many feet, hands, and senses, and so too for their character traits and wisdom. That is why the many are better judges of works of music and of the poets. For one of them judges one part, another another, and all of them the whole thing. So notice his point here. He uses the metaphor of a feast, that when lots of people are contributing and they're bringing their diverse skills into play, that helps everyone. It helps the judgment of the whole to be improved. So he offers a kind of uh, what we might call a perspectival approach to judgment here, that different people bring different judgments, and together, collectively, they add different perspectives, and that allows you to see the whole thing. Imagine all of us together standing around a large sculpture or statue or structure of some kind. Each of us would be situated in one place, and we'd have one particular perspective on this structure in front of us, this artwork in front of us. Um, but each of us would be positioned differently around it. Only together could we see the whole. And so this is the kind of idea that Aristotle is kind of bringing out here. He also makes a similar, comes back to this metaphor of the feast in chapter 15. This is on page 393 of our textbook. And in the second column here, Aristotle comes back to this idea. He says, a city-state consists of many people, just like a feast to which many contribute, and is better than one that is a unity and simple. That is why a crowd can also judge many things better than any single individual. Besides, he says, a large quantity is more incorruptible. So the multitude, like a larger quantity of water, are more incorruptible than the few. The judgment of an individual is inevitably corrupted when he is overcome by anger or some other passion of this sort, whereas in the same situation, it is a task to get all the citizens to become angry and make mistakes at the same time. So here he's not only offering the idea about all of us collectively having a better perspective on the whole than any one of us individually, but here he's also adding another point where he is saying together the collective is less corruptible than single person is, or a small group is. They, like water, he says, a greater amount of water dilutes a poison that you could put in it. It's less pollute. It's more difficult to pollute when you have a large amount of water. So here it's a similar kind of idea. Again, very different from Plato here, where he is arguing that the multitude can actually exercise, and often does in practice exercise, much better judgment than individuals. So the many are generally a better judge than the individual, going just on the PowerPoint here, because they combine their various partial perspectives into a more complete picture, and they are less corruptible than an individual. A further point I just want to add to this, which is relevant in terms of the polity and mixing the oligarchic and democratic elements to create a kind of moderate society with mass participation in which the many rule in the interest of the whole. Aristotle also talks about the importance of cultivating a large and powerful middle class. Because for Aristotle, a middle class avoids the extremes of the rich who are spiteful and greedy and don't really want to obey anybody else. and they don't want to put their interest below anybody else. And so the rich have that kind of fault, but then the poor, he says, are also, they have lots of faults too, because they're envious and they don't know how to command, Aristotle says. And so you avoid the extreme faults that either the rich or the poor contain. And by creating a large middle class, you avoid those extremes and you create a more moderate society in which the middle class can look out best for the interests of the whole. So you have another kind of practical judgment here of Aristotle of how to think about creating or approximating what he calls a polity. Yeah, John.
Considering the vices that they introduce into society, would Plato, not Plato, again, Aristotle advocate for creating a society where there is only the middle class, where there is no rich or poor?
I think what he would say to that is that there's practical constraints. He does think it kind of inevitably have rich and poor, but you are trying to cultivate as large of a middle class as you can. I think, yeah, he would probably say, again, as much as you can, you create a large middle class. Um, um, and yet that's not going to be entirely possible. And so I think it would just be a kind of practical answer to that question, but that you're trying to create as large of a middle class as you can. So this is the best constitution in general or in practice, and under most widely available conditions. Um, oh, sorry, no, that's okay. Um, That's my slides are out of order a bit here. Okay, so actually, we're due for a break now. I'll stop sharing here. I'll fix my slide. We've got one last slide to talk about with Aristotle, and then we'll move on to talk about Machiavelli in the second half of class. So we'll just take a few more minutes on Aristotle after I fix my slides here, and we'll wrap up and start talking about the Prince shortly after. So, but let's take our 10 minutes right now. It's 1:32. Let's try to resume by 1:42. Okay. See you shortly. Sorry, folks. Didn't realize I was muted. I was um, talking there and then realized. So let me just reiterate what I was just starting to say. Um, uh, I just wanted to point out that there's, as usual, some really good questions and really good discussions happening in the chat. Unfortunately, I can't really get to all of them just because I'm already getting quite behind in a number of lectures. And so I just encourage you to take these questions. There's a lot of really good questions and discussion points. Take them to your tutorials, and that's the perfect space to have further discussion, which are unfortunately the lecture doesn't always allow us to do. Okay, so let me come back to my PowerPoint here, which I've now corrected, and we can finish off our discussion of Aristotle. So we had left off here, talking about the best constitution in general, and how Aristotle argues that that is what he calls a polity, and it is created by combining oligarchic and democratic elements in the society. And that starts to give us a sense of one last kind of point that I want to make here, which is around the further categories of the best constitution, which is around the best within a particular set of circumstances. And on this, you can't really say what the best constitution is for a particular circumstance in general, because it really depends on the circumstances. But what are you striving for when you're judging the particular circumstances of any particular place and what is best within those constraints and circumstances? What are you trying to do as a statesman, as a political scientist, as someone who's involved in or observing politics or analyzing politics in that particular place? What are you trying to do? Well, you're trying to understand how the society is comprised. So every political community is comprised of different political elements or classes, according to Aristotle, and in different proportions. So the first thing you need to do to judge properly, to have good practical wisdom about what is best in a particular time and place, is to understand the composition of the society in its different elements or classes and their proportions. And what you're trying to do then is you're trying to find the appropriate balance of these different elements or classes using different principles of distribution of power. So Aristotle talks about a number of what we can call principles of distribution of power. He talks about excellence, so moral, intellectual virtue. That is a principle of distribution of power. If you have people who are very excellent in virtue, they are kind of a distinct class that deserves its own political, its own kind of share of political power. Wealth is another criteria or a principle for the distribution of political power. And freedom, or in other words, being a free citizen rather than a slave, that is another principle for the distribution of political power and a corresponding class. So you're trying to figure out what's the appropriate distribution of power that will promote justice within the circumstances of that society. So you're trying to figure out what's the best kind of combination of different distributions of power. So you're trying to combine them differently. If you have a group of people who's particularly excellent in their moral and intellectual virtue, they should have a share of power. If you've got you've got free-born citizens, heads of household, they should have a role in political power, and the wealthy should have a role in political power. And you're trying to balance these so that you're using the judgment of all these different groups and their different interests to produce an effect in which the common interest is looked after. And this is, so you're trying to promote justice, but what does he mean by justice? Justice for Aristotle means something like promoting the common interest by giving appropriate treatment to everyone. And so you notice I say appropriate treatment to everyone, not equal treatment to everyone, because Aristotle thinks, again, you've got different qualifications, you've got different traits and different principles of power. And so you've got to treat equals equally and unequals unequally. So for Aristotle, justice involves treating people appropriately, not equally. It's appropriate to treat equals equally when they are relevantly equal, but when they are relevantly unequal, you need to treat them unequally. So, for example, sometimes it's for Aristotle, he thinks for certain financial matters, it's going to be more relevant to um, treat rich people equally and give them a share of ruling, but to treat them unequally to people without any wealth. Because the poor won't necessarily have the right kind of judgment for certain kinds of money matters or financial matters. And so Aristotle thinks you need to balance these oligarchic elements that treat the rich, give priority to the rich, and you need to balance that with other institutions that treat all citizens, all freeborn citizens equally in a way. That is the kind of democratic elements. But you also might, if you have a group of people who are particularly good, have particularly good judgment, you might want them to have a special role in government. So we can maybe think of this as like, how power was distributed in, say, the pandemic. And remember, you had like the creation of a council of like scientists who um, were thought to have a certain kind of expertise to bring to bear on the situation. And so they were given a particular role in political power. They were distributed political power in a particular way because of their expertise or judgment. So again, this is just an example of how Aristotle thinks you need to assess in any particular society the composition, the different classes, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and you need to come up with a system that balances their different strengths and weaknesses that overall produces the common interest or looks out for the common interest by treating people appropriately in different ways. So this is again Aristotle's kind of practical political judgment, where it's not always about thinking about things in the ideal, the abstractly ideal. It's not even always about thinking about the generally best. It's often about judging within circumstances. And so that's what he spends a lot of his time on, is thinking about within the circumstances, how do you approximate the common good within a particular constitution or composition of a society. So these are kind of different levels of political judgment that Aristotle lays out for us in books 3 and 4. Okay, so I want to leave Aristotle there and move on now to our discussion of Machiavelli's The Prince. Now, here I should say we are making a major jump, as I've said before, in time and place. We're moving from ancient Greece to Renaissance Italy in the 15th and early 16th centuries. And so here we have a kind of rough map here of Italy at the end of the 15th century. And if you see here in the center, you've got the Republic of Florence in kind of a pink, peach, salmon type color there. You've got the Republic of Florence. And that's where Machiavelli lives, and so, but if you look around, you see that this is a very complex political map. You've got the papal state, so the church has a very important political role in the region. You've got different republics. You also have different monarchies and different empires in the area. You have kingdoms. So you have a very complex political map of different kinds of political regimes. And Machiavelli is someone who studies the complexities of politics. He's also very much involved in politics. He's not just a political scientist, but an observer of politics, but he is a statesman. He is involved very directly in the politics of the Republic of Florence. And he is somebody who is kind of a diplomatic, spends most of his adult life as a kind of diplomat type, a bureaucrat, diplomat kind of figure within the regime of Florence. But at a certain point, the Republic of Florence falls, and you have a very powerful family in this region who one member is like the Pope at this time, and another member is like, or some members are like ruling Florence and other areas. And so you have this family, the Medici family, you may have heard of, they've made TV shows about them. The Medici family comes to power in Florence. And Machiavelli basically writes this book and dedicates it to the Medici, because what happens is Machiavelli, and this context is just kind of interesting and relevant to the reading the text. Machiavelli is a diplomat, a figure himself who like goes around, travels around to different countries here and different regimes, and he learns about different rulers. So he gains a kind of encyclopedic knowledge about the different rulers and different territories and different regimes all around the region. And yet when the Republic of Florence falls and the Medicis come to power, Machiavelli is accused of as being kind of a traitor to the Medicis, and he is imprisoned, he is tortured, and he ends up being exiled, kind of sent out to the countryside where he lives out his days. But he always claims to have been falsely accused, that he wasn't a traitor. He tries to win back the favor of the Medicis, and he writes this text. He writes this book, The Prince, as a kind of handbook to the Medicis. And it was part of a broader style or genre of writing at this time, which is kind of thought of as like a handbook for princes, a handbook for rulers. There was a style of writing where people would write in this like kind of like self-help for princes, advice book for rulers. And so Machiavelli writes this book, The Prince, in this vein and dedicates it to the Medici, saying to them, and you will see early on in the dedication of The Prince, notice the end of the dedication at the beginning of The Prince. Machiavelli writes, I therefore beg your magnificence to accept this little gift in the spirit in which it is sent. If you read it carefully and think over what it contains, you will recognize it is an expression of my dearest wish, which is that you achieve the greatness your good fortune and your other fine qualities seem to hold out to you. And if your magnificence, high up at the summit as you are, should occasionally glance down into these deep valleys, you will see I have to put up with the unrelenting malevolence of undeserved ill fortune. So he says, I've been wrongly condemned here. I've experienced very bad luck here. I've been tortured and exiled. And please look down favorably upon me and see that I can be an asset to you. He wants to get back into the political game and be of use to the Medicis. Now, unfortunately, we have no record of the Medicis ever reading this text, and certainly not recognizing it. And Machiavelli ends up dying out in exile, never having gotten back into the political game that he loved and desired to be a part of so much. But that's relevant for noticing that this text is actually quite a motivated text, and it's for a particular purpose. But it also is misleading in this way, in that in this text, you have it geared towards a certain kind of political problem or context, of the rule of a prince, of a monarch. By the prince, he means more generally what we think of as like any category of monarch, of ruler, who has like sole discretionary rule over a territory and a population. That's what this text is geared towards. But what he will, as we'll see, Machiavelli is actually he's actually most concerned, and his ideal is not what he calls a principality, which is a territory ruled by a monarch or a prince. His ideal is actually the kind of society he grew up in, a republic. So he will contrast republics and principalities right at the beginning of the text. So we'll see that in a moment, what that contrast kind of consists of and how it plays out in this book, and the particularities and limitations of this text. So let me start in on the themes here of the Prince with the kind of some themes I want to pull out from the first 14 chapters. And these are short chapters, and we're not going to cover all the themes in them, but I want to pull out a few key themes from these chapters. The first one is this division between republics and principalities that Machiavelli makes right at the beginning, and that plays an important role in terms of setting what this text is about and what it is not about. So the chapter 1 begins saying all states, all forms of government that have had and continue to have authority over men have been and are either republics or principalities. So he makes one grand distinction to begin here. All states, all forms of authority in government, forms of government, are either republics or principalities. Okay, so he's starting from a very different kind of taxonomy or categorization system than do the others that we've looked at this point. And what he says by chapter 2 is that this book is only about principalities. Principalities, again, are those forms of government that are ruled by a monarch, a single kind of ruler, or a bloodline, a hereditary kind of form of rule in which power is invested in that bloodline. A republic, on the other hand, is like the society Machiavelli grew up in, Florence, which is a society that involves widespread participation, where the collective rules itself in some way. So that is a republic for Machiavelli, as opposed to a principality, the rule of a particular bloodline versus the rule of the people over themselves, a self-ruling people. So even though we are only reading The Prince, it is in fact a bit deceiving about Machiavelli's broader commitments and political values, because in fact Machiavelli thinks the highest form of government is a republic where the people rule themselves. And a principality is a lesser kind of form of government where a monarch rules. But in fact, the way Machiavelli ends up kind of arguing is that what is actually kind of implicitly kind of best for a principality is for a prince or a ruler, a monarch, to actually set up and teach the people to ultimately come to rule themselves. So to be a founder, and that this doesn't come out very much in this text, I'm just kind of setting it out more broadly, that In fact, it is best for the people to rule themselves, and principalities are therefore best when they set people up over time. They teach them and eventually set them up, lead them towards becoming a self-governing people. But that's all kind of bracketed because in this text, he's focused on, and again, that's the motivated part of this text. He's focused on how do you advise a prince of how to rule and how to maintain and grow their power. That's the main focus of this particular text. And so it's quite limited. You don't get the sense here of Machiavelli's overall kind of political commitments. His broader political commitments come out, and his commitment to republics and his analysis of republics comes out in his other most famous text, which is called the Discourses on Livy. That is that what we call the Discourses. That book is about republics. So here at the beginning of The Prince, he says, this text will only be about principalities. Elsewhere, I discuss republics, and that's in his text called The Discourses, which he was writing at the same time as he's writing The Prince. So this book is about principalities alone, but Machiavelli actually prefers republics. So we keep that in mind for context, even though we don't really get that argument and sense from this text alone because it is focused on principalities. Now, in the early chapters here of this text, what we get is Machiavelli laying a lot of groundwork. And what he does is he provides a wide-ranging discussion of different kinds of principalities based on different crucial factors that play a crucial role in that principality. So, given the variables of their histories and how the ruler came to power, those variables play crucial roles in terms of how to rule that particular principality. So Machiavelli lays out a wide range of variables and gives advice based on them. And so in these early chapters, you get both this sense of the different categories of principality and also his characteristic different pieces of advice that he gives for how rulers should rule in different kinds of circumstances. So many of Machiavelli's general pieces of advice for rulers come out in these early chapters. So what are some of these variables and these categories of principalities that he lays out in a kind of schematic way in these early chapters? Oh, sorry. Okay. Let me say one more thing here before I move forward to the next slide. And that is that one key concept emerges here in these early chapters that we have to pay attention to. And that is the concept of virtue. But again, here we've kept it in its kind of original Italian form, as the translator of the text does. And why is that? It's because this concept is so distinctive and important. Now, we've been talking a lot about virtue because virtue was, of course, a very important concept for Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. For the ancient Greeks, virtue was a really important word and concept. And it had a very distinctive moral quality. It was about moral virtue that cultivates the soul, treating people appropriately, living rightly, living according to a sense of what's good for the whole. That is the virtue for the ancient Greeks. But Machiavelli here also uses the word virtue, but he uses it very differently. he uses it in a distinctively political sense of a kind of political skill, a political acumen or strength, and kind of political ability. This political skillfulness is how he uses the word virtue in a very different sense than the moral virtue. So this is political virtue, political skillfulness, good political judgment rather than moral judgment. And that division will be quite important for us as we move through this text. And furthermore, we will also get a sense of one of the great kind of overarching tensions in Machiavelli's thought and in his worldview. And that is the tension between skill, political skill, and your judgment, your political judgment versus fortune, good or bad luck. And for Machiavelli, this is kind of a key tension. There are kind of the circumstances and the things that are happening that are outside of your control. That's the realm of fortune. The things that you can't change and that happen outside of your control. But then there is your own political skill and judgment and your own imprint that you can put on the world. That is the realm of virtue, political virtue as a prince. And you are always contending against fortune or the circumstances. They are outside of your control mostly, but they are also something that you can affect. You can affect and understand and react and channel the circumstances and the fortune in some way through your own bold action in the world. And so for Machiavelli, that's part of political virtue or skill, is contending against changing circumstances and changing luck and trying to stay one step ahead in that struggle against fortune. Okay, so now let's move. This is a schematic kind of rough sketch of some of the distinctions he makes. Now, in the first early chapters of this text, not all of these are important. I just am laying this out to kind of give a bit of an overview of how these early chapters go and what they look like. So what he's doing is he starts off saying, okay, there's two forms of government, either principalities or republics. And recall, he said, we're only dealing with principalities here. Republics I deal with in my other book. So here we deal with principalities. And he starts with one key distinction between principalities. He says they're either new or they're hereditary. So what does he mean by this? Well, he means a prince either comes to power through hereditary means where he inherits the territory through because he's in the right bloodline. So that prince is either a hereditary ruler or they are gaining new territory that wasn't previously ruled by their bloodline. And this matters because if you are a hereditary prince and you've simply inherited rule over a territory that your forefathers ruled, this is kind of the easiest case because Machiavelli says in this case your people are used to being ruled by you. They have been ruled by your forefathers. They probably celebrated your birth as the new heir apparent. And so they're kind of used to you. And in this case, you don't need to do much. You keep things largely the same as your forefathers, and things should go along fairly well. Like, don't rock the boat too much. Just kind of keep things largely as they've been. Keep the regime largely intact from your predecessors, and you should be okay. So that's, so he's giving different advice based on different kinds of principalities. Then he says, what about new territory, though? And he says, okay, well, there's different ways of thinking about new territory. One is territory that was like a state before, but it was acquired by you as a new prince, as a prince. You've acquired this territory, um, and kind of tied it to your existing kingdom or your territories, your areas of rule. And he says this kind of case differs in a couple different ways. It matters whether the area that you've taken over is a former principality or a former republic. So I'm moving one step further in the chart now, the distinctions he makes. And he says, if the territory that you acquire was formerly a principality, that's good, because that means the people were used to being ruled by a single prince. And that means you will have an easier time. And he says, what you need to do in this case, and he offers his first like brutal piece of advice, his kind of ruthless piece of advice. And this is why Machiavelli has a kind of bad name where people use his name to mean like ruthlessness. And so if you talk about, oh, that's very Machiavellian, when people talk like that, they mean it as like kind of um, uh, ruthless decision making to get what you want. That tends to be how people use that term of Machiavellian action. And so if he says that if you're formerly a principality, the territory that you take over, all you need to do is you need to wipe out the entire bloodline of the old prince. That's and then you kind of try to keep things roughly the same. The people are used to following a prince. You get rid of all the old bloodline of the prince because they will always be a threat to you. They will want their power back, and you need to make sure that you get rid of all of them. So wipe them out, and then you do a few things, and you should be okay. But if the territory you take over used to be a republic. That is, it used to be a free, self-governing people. He says this is extremely difficult because the people who have ruled themselves don't want to be ruled by a prince. And he says they will always try to hearken back to their former glory, their former status as a self-governing people, as a republic. So it's very hard to subdue a people in this case like this. And so he says, what you need to do is, I need to take some heavier measures. You need to either go and live there in person and let the people see and feel your power. So take your armies, go, take your court, go and live there and make the people see you and fear you and become loyal to you over time. That's one thing. If you can't do that, he says, go and set up colonies there. If you want to take over a place that formerly ruled itself and wants to return to that freedom, you need to set up colonies of people loyal to you. So colonize the place and set up your own people there, who will be loyal to you and who can be your eyes and ears on the ground and help set up a population that's loyal to you. So this is another kind of piece of advice. Or he says sometimes republics will be so difficult to take over that you will just need to decimate them entirely and kind of disperse the people and start over with in the territory, like just decimate the people and spread them out all over, like displace the people entirely and start over. So you see again the brutal advice, very ruthless advice that Machiavelli gives for how to gain power. His main point here is like if you're advising a prince, how do you tell them to secure their power over a place that they want to rule over? So that's kind of the variables of the former principality or the former republic. But then you've got new societies that are like they weren't formerly a principality or a former republic, and they are kind of newly founded societies that you are gaining rule over, or you're like a new prince. You've never ruled anything before. You don't have a any other territory. You've never ruled before. How do you take over new territory in this way? So he means a couple things when he says entirely new. And he goes through a number of variables here. You can acquire, and I'm going to wrap up with this. I know I'm over time. You can, it matters whether you acquire the territory with your own armies. So are you a new ruler who happens to have built up your own armies, even though you haven't had a kingdom before? Have you developed an army? Have you somehow done this, achieved this before you become a prince? That matters because you'll have your own armies, and that's a good thing to have, but very difficult to have. He also says or have you used to gain your power, have you used somebody else's armies? That really matters a great deal because that's a very dangerous situation to be in, is to have used somebody else's armies, because that means they will have some power over you. He also uses other variables, the variables of whether you've established your power through good luck or fortune, or whether you've established your rule through great skill or virtue. This matters as well because if good luck has landed you into a throne, you've got a lot more work to do to secure your power. Whereas if you have established your rule through great skill, you will there was a lot more difficulty up front, but you will have an easier time ruling because you've already developed the skill and judgment of how to rule. So that matters a lot. You already have a great deal of skill, or have you been given power through luck? And you have to develop the skill now that you're in power. And then he adds another category, which is about wickedness. And this is an interesting distinction that I'll leave you with, and that we'll come back to at the starting of next class. And that is he says there's a category that is beyond skill, but it is using wicked actions to come to power. And what's confusing about this is that a lot of what Machiavelli seems to suggest goes under the category of using skill and having political skill. Sounds like it's extremely wicked. So it's not entirely clear how he's making a distinction between wicked actions and virtuous actions. Because, again, a lot of political skill that he talks about seems to overlap a lot with what he calls wicked actions. So there's a confusion there that we have to sort through between what is skill and what is wickedness, and why does he make this distinction? And we'll come back to that question at the starting of next class. So we will leave it there for today, and we will come back next class to talk about, pick up this discussion and, well, try to wrap up, frankly, our discussion of Machiavelli next class as well, because we don't have a lot of time on Machiavelli here. So I'll just take John's question here, and I'll keep recording. But if folks need to go, I know we're out of time. So have a good day, and I will see you on Thursday. John, you have a question?
Yeah, a lot of what's being put forward by Machiavelli seems very similar to the tactics of a noble that was around in Italy during that time, Cesare Borgia, especially when it comes to killing your rivals, which is something he did a lot. He did it a lot with the rule. He did it with the rulers of Camerino. He did it with the Orsini and the Colonna. Was
Good.
he
And yes,
anyways
and
influenced
what
by
we will
Cesare?
see, what we yes, in fact, Borgia is, and we'll talk about Borgia and his kind of valorization of Borgia in the next class, because Borgia turns out to be Machiavelli's main exemplar of how to rule well and how to exhibit good political judgment. Um, uh, that's his main contemporary example for his own contemporaries. And so, yes, that's exactly right. And he will hold up Borgia, and we'll talk about what he says about Borgia in the next class.
Okay.
Okay, great, good question, Aaron.
Yeah, I just had a question. It's not about the class stuff. It's about
Oh, okay. Let me
the
just let me
what?
stop the recording. Then, if it's not about class stuff, I'll stop recording, and then we can talk.